Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar about farm biosecurity. My name is Tess McDougall and I'm a Livestock Industry Development Officer for Agriculture Victoria based in Ararat. Tonight's webinar is proudly supported by the BetterBeef Network, which is part of Agriculture Victoria. The BetterBeef Network aims to deliver timely information, new research, knowledge and technological innovations specifically tailored for pasture-based extensive livestock production systems. Our presenters will be using a PowerPoint presentation during tonight's seminar. Everyone has been sent an email with a PDF copy of that presentation. If you're using the webinar platform tonight, you will see the slides in your browser. The presenter will let you know which slide we're going to so that those can follow along with the PDF. After the presentation, we would be grateful if you could complete a short survey to ensure that we are providing you with the right information in the right time and the right way. After the seminar, you'll be sent a link to the survey, and we suggest that you complete the survey tonight, immediately after the seminar, or tomorrow morning, where the event is still fresh in your mind. This seminar is hosted and managed tonight by Redback Conferencing. Our Redback operators tonight are Luke and Renan. They are here to ensure that the seminar runs smoothly. There will be an opportunity for questions after the presentation. If you're participating tonight on the webinar platform, you can type your question under the Questions tab on the screen at any time. If you're joining us tonight by phone, Luke will provide instructions on how to get your questions in the queue. The agenda for tonight's seminar is as follows. Dr. Jeff Cave, District Veterinary Officer for Agriculture Victoria, will give a first-hand account of his involvement in the United Kingdom's 2001 foot and mouth disease outbreak. Following Jeff's account, I will invite two producers to give details on the biosecurity practices that are embedded in their business. The producers on the panel tonight are Rob Liley from Fish Creek and Joe Toohey from Mount Edgerton. Rob owns a steer fattening operation and Joe and his family run both a breeding herd and a beef trading business. I would like to thank all of our presenters for their involvement tonight. I will now hand over to Jeff to continue the presentation. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks very much, Tess, and welcome to everybody this evening. 2001, it seems a long time ago now, but in some ways for me it doesn't seem that long ago at all because it was such a big event at the time. But yeah, during 2001, in April 2001, I spent 4 weeks in the UK in Cumbria in April 2001. Cumbria, that lovely part of England in the north-west of England, just north of the Lakes District. But as I give the presentation this evening, you'll see that it was a very hectic time for the people of Cumbria, and the environment of Cumbria was quite different to what you'd expect it to be. But just to give an overview of the outbreak before I go on, it was a huge outbreak. 6% of the total livestock population of the UK was destroyed during the outbreak. Billions of pounds were lost to the economy. The UK's ability to export livestock was halted for over 12 months. And no doubt, 18 years on, the people's lives who were affected back then are probably still changed by it. But there were certainly some pertinent lessons that came out from the outbreak. And in some ways, what we do now, or what we have done over the last 18 years, have been quite heavily influenced by the outbreak. So I'll move on to the next slide. As I go to each slide, I'll call the slide number. So we're on to slide 2 now. And slide 2 shows you that quite a large part of the world actually has foot and mouth disease as an endemic disease. So there are parts of the world where it's something that people just have to live with. But it's important to note from that map that a lot of our important trading partners in North America, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, and through Europe are all foot and mouth disease free. And so if we were to have an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, the trade implications to Australia would be huge. And it's estimated that a multi-jurisdictional outbreak in Australia would cost the economy something of the order of $50 billion over 10 years. So it's a staggering amount. And obviously our rural communities would bear the brunt of those type of costs. So to tell you a little bit about the disease itself, we're on to slide 3 now. Foot and mouth disease is characterized, it's a viral disease, it's characterized by being particularly contagious. It's a disease that affects what are known as cloven-toothed animals, so those animals with 2 digits, so primarily thinking of cattle, sheep, goats and pigs. And it generally, in a mature, healthy animal, it generally doesn't actually cause a mortality in the animal. It may do for young animals, but certainly not older animals. But it does cause a severe drop in production. As the name suggests, it affects the mouth and feet of the animal. It does that by causing vesicles, which are like blisters, which rupture and cause nasty sores in the mouth and feet, as well as causing a fever. And of the animals, cattle, which are depicted, an affected cow is depicted in the photo that I'm showing here, they are particularly badly affected by it. They suffer an illness for a couple of weeks, but then they recover from the illness, but they go on to be a carrier of the disease, and because of that, they remain a possible source of infection. We'll go on to slide 4, which shows a clinically affected pig. And as you can see from the photo, pigs too are quite badly affected clinically by foot and mouth disease. One of the features of pigs is that they're known as an amplifier of the disease because they produce a massive virus when they're infected with foot and mouth disease. And so if pigs are part of a foot and mouth disease outbreak, they have quite a bit of significance because of the amount of virus that they produce. Going on to slide 4, I have a picture of an affected sheep. And as you can see from that photo, the lesions, the sores that foot and mouth disease causes in sheep and in goats are relatively mild. So sheep and goats tend to just have a mild disease when they're affected by foot and mouth disease, but they too remain shedders of the virus, and because of that, they remain a spreader of the virus. And as I give the account of what happened in the UK, you will appreciate the importance of sheep during the UK foot and mouth disease outbreak in 2001. So we'll move on to slide 6, and slide 6 shows the extent of the outbreak back in 2001. It also shows the large number of cases throughout the country, and if you look up to the northwest of England, you'll see a massive red dots, which is Cumbria, which was where I was located during the outbreak. But the frightening thing of this is that the UK authorities didn't realise that there was a problem until a large amount of this spread had occurred. And so infection had been seeded throughout the country before it was realised that a foot and mouth disease outbreak was there. And so from that, I guess some of the take-home important messages are the importance of early notification of an outbreak, early recognition of an outbreak, so being able to recognise foot and mouth disease, and also if an outbreak has been confirmed or if it has been strongly, or if there's strong suspicion, to have a livestock standstill to prevent any further spread, because the UK had such a large job on hand before they realised that there was a problem, and that really led to it being an ongoing, very large outbreak. So in Australia, to try and circumvent some of these things, well, one thing, and I'll talk about some of the lessons that we've learnt and some of the ways that we're trying to overcome them as the presentation goes on. But one important number for you all to mark down is that in Australia we have an established emergency animal disease hotline, which is 1800 675 888, which is there to support early notification of any suspect exotic disease. So let's go on to slide 7, and we go back to that slide of the pig, because it was a pig in an abattoir in Essex, which is in the southeast of the country, which was where foot and mouth disease was first recognised, first diagnosed. So there was a group of pigs actually at that abattoir in Essex, and some tracing had to go in to work out where those pigs had come from. And it turned out that those pigs had come from a property in a place called Heddon on the Wool, which is up in the northwest of the country, not far from Newcastle. So they went on to visit that property, and what they found when they visited that property was that there was a piggery full of pigs with various stages of foot and mouth disease. There was also evidence that the owner of the pigs had been illegally feeding waste food or swill, and hadn't notified or recognised the disease, and certainly hadn't notified authorities of the disease. And as I mentioned earlier on, pigs being the amplifier of virus meant that there was every chance that the disease had spread to neighbouring properties. So we see in Australia some of our greatest risks are being swill feeding, and so swill feeding has been banned for a number of years from Australia. It would be through the importation of the illegal importation of contaminated meat, and so border security is particularly important in Australia. And another possible way in which foot and mouth disease could come into the country is through contaminated material. And so once again, border security being an important feature, and also good on-farm biosecurity being another important feature. Because as I go through tonight's presentation, you'll appreciate that it's a whole lot easier to keep a disease like foot and mouth disease out of the country and out of our livestock industries than it is to deal with it. So we'll move to slide 8 next. And I guess this is a continuation of the story of what happened after the pigs, because from there were a number of neighbouring properties to that piggery. Some of those properties had sheep, and at that time of year, people may have thought that their sheep had a bit of foot scald or whatever. There was quite a bit of trading that went on amongst sheep, and so there would have been sheep that were excreting foot and mouth disease that would have gone through a series of sale yards and basically seeded the country with foot and mouth disease without anybody knowing it at the time. Because as I mentioned early in the presentation, sheep are a silent spreader of the virus. So I guess as the presentation goes on, and we're up to slide 9 at the moment, as the presentation goes on, I'll show you a number of, I guess, confronting photographs, but for me this is the most frightening photograph, because this photograph shows the spread of the disease before the authorities realised that there was a problem. So what happened was that the disease began in that piggery, it spread to some neighbouring properties, it spread through some sheep sale yards, including one called Longtown Market, which is in Cumbria. And when you look at the massive arrows that come out of Longtown Market from that slide, you can see why Cumbria was so heavily contaminated with foot and mouth disease. And then from there it went through a series of other sale yards, and seeded a large part of the country. And then from there, and we've moved on to slide 10, from there a large amount of the spread happened through direct transmission, so through aerosol from neighbour to neighbour, or through the movement of contaminated material through the countryside. And by the end of it, as you can see in that slide, when it talks about cases there, that's referring to each individual infected property. So there were over 1,000 individual infected properties during the UK foot and mouth disease outbreak. Slide 11 shows a typical epidemic curve of a lot of infectious diseases, highly infectious diseases. This one is the epidemic curve for the UK foot and mouth disease outbreak. And I guess early on in the piece, when the authorities were wondering how big this outbreak was going to become, At that stage, they didn't know where the peak was going to be or how high it was going to be. As you can see, the peak was at about the end of March, at the beginning of April, which happened to be the time that I arrived in the country. And then from there, it dropped. But the other thing that you can see from this is that it's got a long and drawn-out tail, which is another thing that's typical of exotic diseases. Emergency animal diseases are quite different from your bushfire scenario, where things happen, quickly and are over relatively quickly. Unfortunately, emergency animal diseases can go on for months. And the last case in the UK was actually the 30th of September, which was, 7 months after the first case. And from there would have been months of showing freedom of disease and things like that. And so there would have been a very long period in which movement and trade was disrupted. So slide 12, I guess, comes into my own personal account of the outbreak, where I was one of a number of Australian veterinarians who were sent to the UK. The reason that we were sent was that there was a reciprocal arrangement between the UK, Australia, New Zealand and Canada, and the UK needed as much help as they could get from overseas personnel. So I was one of a number of veterinarians to travel across to the UK. I went to Carlisle, and this is a picture, an aerial photograph of the control centre at Carlisle. And it was a really hectic time to be. So this is a photograph of, slide 13 shows a photograph of the control centre in Carlisle. And in some ways the photographs, or the series of photographs, the 4 photographs, don't fully convey how hectic things were there. But yeah, it was very much an unnatural environment. So I showed that slide, this is slide 14, I showed that slide earlier of Longtown Market and how the movements out of Longtown Market seeded the surrounding countryside with the disease. This photograph shows the infected premises radiating out from Carlisle. So Longtown Market is in Carlisle, and radiating out from there are all of these infected premises. So I guess that on the ground, and this is slide 15, meant that all of those fields that you would normally expect to see with livestock and all of the barns that you would expect to see with livestock were basically bare as far as you could see until you got out towards the edge of the outbreak, as it was at the time. And then, unfortunately, often the picture was a bleak one like this, where livestock were being slaughtered. And the reason that so many animals were slaughtered during the UK outbreak was that the authorities there saw eradication as being their goal. And I mentioned earlier that an animal that has had foot and mouth disease that recovers remains a shedder of virus, and hence a possible source of continuing contamination. And so to eradicate the disease, there was the need for this wholesale slaughter of stock. And certainly Australia's goal would be to eradicate foot and mouth disease as well. In those countries that I mentioned earlier, in which foot and mouth disease is endemic, often those countries live by vaccinating their stock. But I guess the price they pay for that is that they've always got outbreaks of foot and mouth disease, and they never truly eradicate the disease. So as well as the fields being bare, this is slide 16, there were attempts to try and minimise the spread of contaminated material around the countryside. And so things like this were set up. This is a decontamination ramp. And if you look at it, you'll think, well, it's possibly not going to do all that much. But I guess it's worth remembering that the logistical challenge that the UK authorities faced at the time, given the scale of the outbreak, meant that they could only do things as well as they could. And certainly in the case of a smaller outbreak, you would expect to see things like roadblocks and that. But at the time in Cumbria, this was the best that they could do given the scale of the outbreak. So my own roles during the outbreak were twofold. Well, actually, my role, and this is slide 17, was as a field epidemiologist. And one of the things that I did as a field epidemiologist was look at the lesions to try and work out how old they were, how long infection had been on a person's property, and from that try and work out where the disease may have come from and also where it may be spreading to next. You'll see some issues with the biosecurity in that photo in that they're ungloved hands, which isn't ideal. The actual photograph that was taken there, I took in an afternoon when I witnessed an Ayrshire stud, which had been years in the making, basically slaughtered out during the space of an afternoon, which was a terrible thing to watch. The other role that I had, and this is slide 18, was to visit the owners of infected properties, once again to try and establish some tracing information. And it was an interesting situation visiting those property owners because once again, as a result of the scale of the outbreak, there were a number of these people had seen their stock slaughtered out and then their properties quarantined, and then basically they hadn't had a visitor until I came along maybe a week later. And so you can imagine from the farming community's point of view in this quarantine situation that it would have been a very isolating situation. It was also interesting spending time with these people. Their phones would ring incessantly. That was their way of communicating with the outside world. And also they would have the radio on, BBC Radio, which provided an excellent service. And I guess as you're listening to this presentation, you may be wondering whether there was much in the way of protest, because obviously what was happening over there was a huge upheaval for the rural communities who were affected. I guess from the property owner's point of view, and sorry, this is slide 19, from the property owner's point of view, they were in a situation where they were either quarantined because they'd had foot and mouth disease on their property, or else they were almost in a sort of a form of self-quarantine in that they didn't want to introduce foot and mouth disease onto their property. So there was very little movement of property owners. But that's not to say that there weren't protests, and the protest that this photograph is showing here is a group of people who didn't want to see their village as being the site of a mass burial site. It's interesting, this is back in 2001, and it's before the advent of social media. So it would be interesting to see what would happen now in a similar situation. I'm sure that social media would have quite a large role to play where it didn't play any sort of role back in 2001. So in terms of what happened to the livestock, and this is slide 20, what happened to the livestock once they were slaughtered, it was dealt with in two ways. One of the ways was through the use of funeral pyres, and I remember looking across the Cumbrian landscape not long after I arrived, and in different directions I would sort of see billowing smoke coming from funeral pyres. Or, as slide 21 shows, mass burial was used, and this was probably the main way in which livestock were disposed of during the UK, during the outbreak in Cumbria. And this photograph is taken at a place called Great Orton, where millions of livestock were disposed of, and I would imagine that this site remains, an engineering feat to this day, because there are still millions of livestock that would be buried there. One fact with once livestock have been slaughtered, there's still a potential cause of spread of disease just through mechanical means, but they're no longer excreting virus through aerosol, through their breath or through other excretions, and so basically that's one way of, I guess, eradicating the virus. So when I began the presentation this evening, I alluded to the fact that there were large numbers involved, and this is slide 22. When I look at the final statistics, in some ways it's just hard to get your head around them. Premises on which animals were slaughtered, over 10,000, which is a huge number. Over 4 billion animals slaughtered as the result of the outbreak. We'll go on to slide 23. And then due to the inability to move stock, there was also 2 million animals that were slaughtered just due to the fact that they couldn't carry on their normal livestock practices of moving them out of the barns onto the fields, out of a piggery, all of those types of things. And so the upshot of it was that there were something like 6 billion animals that were slaughtered as a result of the outbreak. But as I mentioned earlier on the 30th of September, the final case of foot and mouth disease was seen in the UK. And so from a very difficult beginning, to the UK's credit, they were eventually able to eradicate the disease, but not without considerable pain and cost in the process. So slide 24, you may sort of wonder what it was like for a person like myself going there for 4 weeks, and how you cope with an emergency situation like that. And I guess for me, my one saving grace was that I knew when I arrived there that I was there for 4 weeks, and after that I would be able to leave, come back to Australia, and basically not be having to deal with it directly. But the same couldn't be said by for the affected people in the UK, or those that were having to deal with the outbreak. It went on for months and months, and I'm sure that for the people who were affected back then, it's probably still going on for them, even though the countryside may be beginning to, may have returned to normal from the outside. I'm sure that the scars are still there. So there were, slide 25, there were quite a few lessons that we learnt from the UK outbreak. I've mentioned a few of them already. One of them was the importance of being able to recognise the disease. And you can appreciate that for an Australian veterinarian where the disease is exotic, as a day-to-day thing, we don't get to see foot and mouth disease. But it's seen as being important that we're able to recognise it. And one of the things that Australia has done is given the opportunity to quite a large number of veterinarians now, and also personnel who deal with livestock, just in the recognition of foot and mouth disease. And the only place that you can do that is to go to a country in which foot and mouth disease is endemic. And this photograph is taken at real-time training, which has been carried out a number of times now in Nepal. Some of the other ways in which we're preparing for a foot and mouth disease, currently Agriculture Victoria is putting a large amount of work into the preparation for a livestock standstill, should one ever be needed. In Victoria, Agriculture Victoria would be the lead agency for an exotic disease outbreak. And as an ongoing thing, Agriculture Victoria do all sorts of work in preparing, I guess, for the day that we really don't want to see come. Because after my 4 weeks in the UK, just seeing what happened over there, it's really one of those things which I really hope I never see in Australia. And touch wood, it's 1872 since we last saw a case of foot and mouth disease in Australia, and I think it's everybody's responsibility to try and keep it that way, because as I mentioned, keeping it out is so much easier than having to deal with it when it happens. And Tess, I think that takes me to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Jeff, for your insights into the front line of an exotic disease outbreak. I'm sure that you'll all agree that it was both informative and topical. I would now like to introduce our producer panellists. Both Rob and Joe employ biosecurity measures as part of their everyday risk management in their business. Rob Liley will join us first. He will give a brief description of his operation and detail the biosecurity practices that ensure that the risks of trading cattle are kept to a minimum. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Tess, and good evening to everybody. I don't know about you all, but I feel a bit exhausted after Jeff's presentation because that is just huge. We certainly don't want that in Australia. So biosecurity is about securing your farm against disease, pests and weeds. And I would suggest that vigilance by us all is paramount. A little bit of background about myself and Joan, my wife. We're just a small family farm. It's been operating down here at Walkerville for about 45 or 6 years now. 436 odd hectares, and we try and finish between 700 and 800 bullocks each year. High rainfall country, intense stocking, high inputs, high outputs, high risk because of our intensity of our stocking. We used to run cows and calves and first cross ewes producing prime lambs, but that finished some 6 or 7 years ago. As my wife says, we're doing bullocks and taking the foot off the accelerator as my transition to retirement. But I've got news for her. I'm having too much fun. Now I digress. I'm sorry. So please have in mind all the strategies that I go through is strictly in my situation and under my management. But hopefully there are points that I may help you with and perhaps even reinforce strategies that you already have in place. But always have in the back of your mind something that Doug Blood, the Dean of the Faculty of Veterinary Science, said back in the 60s, dead animals have an incredibly depressing low growth rate. So vigilance is the go. We do all that we possibly can to prevent that happening. So looking at our operations, starting off with buying my cattle, and we're trading, obviously, we go to sale yards, and most sale yards now, cattle have been inspected by the Ag Department. So hopefully you're buying cattle that have been inspected and looked at. I try and go for cattle, younger cattle. So we're buying cattle in that sort of 300 to under 350 kilos because the feedlotters push us out of the others. Sometimes you get lucky enough to get into heavier cattle, but we're looking for fit young cattle. So when we've bought these cattle, I generally get my carrier to come over, who's reliable, and obviously I've inspected his trucks and know that they're going to be in good condition, no protrusions, and the cattle are not going to harm themselves. In a sale yard, I will not buy any cattle on soft flooring out of a pen where the trough has been overflowing. Now, that might sound a bit funny to some people, but I had a terrible experience a few years ago where we got something in our cattle very, very similar to Legionnaire's disease, and I truly believe that it came from the soft flooring, which was some infection that got into them, that got into their lungs and went straight to their brain. Obviously, I had Ag Department vets out here and did PMs. Luckily, we nipped it in the bud, and we are all out of there were 250 cattle that we bought out of that sale yard, and we lost half a dozen. But I'm pretty vigilant about where I buy, and I'll walk past pens like that. When the cattle arrive home here, within a few days, if not the next day, they're treated for internal and external parasites and given a clostridial injection. And the reason why I do that is many, many years ago, I bought some sheep, and after a week I started to lose them. We sent them away to be looked at, and we found that they had a clostridial infection. I had not injected them straight off the truck. So that is paramount for me now, as far as disease risk is concerned, that within a few days, the cattle are brought in and tidied up. They're held in sort of confinement areas, for a couple of reasons: to inspect them, make sure everybody's all right, but also get them quiet, teach them a few manners, put them through the yards, get them used to my voice, and just get them quiet. Once they've been treated, they're put out into paddocks, but they are kept in their purchase mobs for quite some months, and they are looked at vigilantly, just to make sure that sort of there's no problems. All the paddocks on our place are named. There are names on the gates. I have a very good farm map, so that works for a number of reasons. That in my stock book, everybody's address is named, when the cattle were bought, who they are, and all that sort of thing. So anything happens to me, anybody can pick that book up and see exactly what's going on. Also, the property plan and names and all that sort of stuff is extremely good for contractors, so you don't have contractors doing things in the wrong paddock. Obviously, when the cattle are bought, the NVDs are kept, which we have to by law anyway, but then if there are any problems, I can look back and see exactly where those cattle were purchased. Moving on into our paddocks, the livestock are all watered through a reticulated system. The only mechanical water on this place basically is at the house, apart from one solar pump. So good clean water is paramount for fattening or finishing livestock in any way, shape or form. I mean, the science tells us that you'll get a 22% increase in productivity by having clean water, and we all know what cattle do when they stand in a dam. All our riparian areas, all our creek areas, all our dam yards are obviously fenced off. There is actually 22% of this farm is livestock domestic livestock are excluded. I stumbled over livestock because we have a huge problem with deer here, and that's something else that we all need to look at and think about in biosecurity terms. Weed contamination, obviously, in those areas can be a problem, so you have to be vigilant with that and keep right up to that. That's part of our farm plan, that we keep on top of our weeds. With animals and deaths, anything that is extremely suspicious is I get veterinarians out to go through and go through them. And we send things away to be tested. Any deaths in the wintertime, the animal is buried. In the wintertime, the animal is burned. In the summertime, obviously, the animal's buried. And there, I've got an area that's well away from waterways and dams where I can do that. So that's really good. Moving on to plant and equipment. I'm a bit fanatical about stericidal. I love it, and when we clean everything up. As you can imagine, trading those cattle, we do a lot in the cattle yards. Gloves are always worn, and I'm very, very strict about everything being cleaned at the end of the day, so that when we start the next day, everything's in pristine condition. I don't want any contamination going on anywhere. If people come onto the place, as I've said in the notes, it's just so easy to get them to dunk their boots in some stericidal, and nobody minds doing that. Be vigilant, really vigilant about people coming onto your place, particularly linesmen and people like that who you don't know where they've been. And also veterinarians. Most veterinarians are really good about, washing when they leave places. Just make sure that's happening as well. The other thing that I'd like to say is, I think you being vigilant about your farm is so important. Just keep your eyes open. As Jeff pointed out, at the abattoirs, this foot and mouth just spread so quickly because nobody was vigilant about it. So be very careful. Don't cut corners. And we've just we're at the coalface. We've got to make this all work. So good luck to you all, and I hope you've been able to gain something from my little chat and also from the notes. So Tess, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. I'll now like to introduce Joe Toohey. He will also give us a brief description of his operation and detail some of the biosecurity practices that they employ to keep their business safe. So over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Tess. My name's Joe Toohey. I farm at Mount Edgerton, which is about, it's 30 k's east of Ballarat. We're in about a 600 millimetre rainfall area when we get it. This year we have, and a lot of years we don't. But very similar to Bob, I was just amazed at how he's described that, what he does, and it's very, very similar to what we do. Our operation's a little bit different where we don't have them longer term. Our cattle come in, if we opportunity buy, if there's an opportunity to buy cattle at the right price, we'll buy them, and they come in, but that we normally only feed for 90 days. They go on the grain for 90 days, but very similar setup. We try to stay away from the sale yards as much as we can. We've developed a very good rapport with a lot of agents and actually different farmers. We love buying vendor-bred cattle because we find they just do a lot better for us. We don't have the problems. We don't have the foot soreness. We don't have BRD. There's lots of problems we avoid by staying away from the yards, but we do buy at the yards. And one of the reasons, one of the things we do stipulate if we have a buyer there is not to buy small lots. Don't go in and buy the ones and twos, because if anything is going to be crooked or something wrong with it, we find that, if there's a one or a two in that mob of 20 or 25, whatever we've bought, and there's that, and you say, well, that's too odd, but you look at the vendor deck and you go, and normally if you're going to get a problem, that's about where you get it. The difference in buying vendor-bred cattle is absolutely enormous. Same thing with the trucks. We use certain carriers that we know their trucks are right. They deliver them right. It's just the way it's done. We run a cow and calf operation. It's on a different farm or part of this farm. We do run some grain-fed cattle, but everything is double fenced. We have a plantation down the centre so that, the cattle can't actually get nose-to-nose contact. It's just the same thing with water troughs. We run all water troughs rather than dams. Some paddocks do have dams in them, but you'll find once your stock are used to drinking that bit of water they'll tell you where they want to drink, and they'll go and drink out of the troughs. And a lot of the dams, we don't run a lot of dams, but the trough system works really, really well. With anyone coming onto the place, the same thing as Bob said, we don't use a steriliser all that much, but with vets, we don't do a lot with vets. We still lose cattle with BRD and problems like that, which is bovine respiratory disease, and you'll get a bit of that. That's brought on by stress. We get a bit of that. Well, same thing. In the winter time, we'll burn them, and in the summertime, we'll bury them. It's just from my experience with cow and calf operation, from the minute they hit the ground, they're looking to die. Whether it's from a disease or starvation or cold or whatever, but all they want to do is die from the minute they hit the ground. But we try to keep them alive. That's our job, is to keep them alive and get them to where they've got to go. But, it's biosecurity is a big thing. One of my biggest concerns, just looking over the whole show, is small farmers, city farmers. I'm not picking on them, but they'll come out and there's to me, I don't think that we're going to be we are a concern because we've got cattle coming and going. But to me, the biggest worry is the bloke that puts a couple of cattle in, picks them up at the market and he drops them out in his paddock, and he's got a 10-acre block there, and, it's just on for young and old. And I hope we never ever run into foot and mouth, because it will be the end of us. If we ever run into a problem like that, we'll just shut up shop. But that's one of my biggest concerns with the thing, with this livestock production. is, if vigilance, as Bob said, it's a must. And we're around our cattle a fair bit, and in our system we don't grain feed we feed in the paddock rather than locked up on tight little areas. A lot of our cattle, we might put 150 cattle in a 30-acre paddock, and we're through, like in the lane system, we're through that lane nearly every day, if not 2 or 3 times a day. And if there's a beast over on the corner or sitting down along the fence and you're a bit wary of what's going on, you just go over and just have a look and just see what he or she is talking about, whether they've hurt themselves on the truck, whether they're lame, or whether there's something more sinister. And vigilance is the main thing with what we do as far as trading. But with a closed herd, it's a little bit different, but you still have this. They do that. But as everything that Rob said is very similar to what we practice. As far as when the truck's back in, no livestock, where they back into the yards, well, there's no livestock ever get out onto that area. It's mown lawn, it's all a gravel track in, and the lawns, we just mow it and keep it mowed, but no stock ever. If anything comes out of the truck, well, they still carry it out on their hooves, but, they're just not in around that area, which makes a difference. But, with feed, any of our food trucks that come in, don't come into the yard, nothing's allowed out in the paddocks. So as far as anyone going out in the paddock, if someone comes to look at a livestock buyer, comes to look at our cattle, they get in side by side, and we go out and we look at the cattle that way. They're not walking around in the paddock with the stock. So we're very strict that way. It's more of an awareness thing. All biosecurity it's an awareness that everyone should have. Like years ago, with cattle care and all that, with chemicals, it's no different. Like you don't have chemical drums laying around. Everything's locked up. It's an awareness thing, and it's something that, as farmers, we have to get better and better at it. And I think that's sort of a rough overview of what we do. Probably better off. I'm better answering questions. I'm trying to tell you what's going on because I know exactly what we try to do and what we accomplish. And if someone's got some questions, well, that'll make my job a lot easier. So, Jess, I might go back to you, and hopefully we've got some questions and we can answer them for people.
Thank you very much, Joe. We will now open the webinar for questions. I'll just ask Luke to explain the process for placing your question in a queue for those on the phone. So over to you. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks, Tess, and thanks to our presenters. For all our callers on the line, if you'd like to ask a question, you can join the queue by pressing *1 on your telephone keypad. So just a reminder there, for all of our callers on the telephone this evening, to ask a question, you can do so by pressing *1. We'll just pause a moment to assemble a question queue. We don't appear to be having any questions coming through over the phone, so back through to you, Tess.
That's all good. Okay, so I've got a question for you, Jeff. So what about the risks that we cannot control on farm?
The risks that we cannot control on farm. Yeah, it's a good question actually, and I think that it's one of the things that makes biosecurity for people quite difficult. And I guess the best answer to that question is to try and do as much as you can about the risks that you can control. Certainly, if you're the most likely way in which you're going to bring a disease or weeds or pests or whatever onto your property is just on the back of the truck with the stock that you're buying in. So I think that needs to be your number one priority with biosecurity. Taking on board the things that our last speakers were talking about as well, they are all things that they are doing to minimise the biosecurity risks on their farms. But I think that it's important not to kind of give up on it and think, oh well, there are things that I can't control, so why should I bother? I think that the important thing is that you really try and work on the things that you can control.
Thanks, Jeff. And what are the difference between NVDs and LPA systems?
I guess NVDs are part of the LPA system. So LPA stands for Livestock Production Assurance, which is which is overseen by Meat and Livestock Australia, and NVDs stands for National Vendor Declarations, which are the declarations that you make each time stock move from one property identification code to another. And so, yeah, there's this mandatory requirement when stock are moved from one property identification code to another to use an NVD. LPA is a form of assurance overseen by Meat and Livestock Australia, and Biosecurity is one facet of that.
Thank you, Jeff. And what does a livestock standstill mean for Victoria?
So what a livestock standstill would mean, and yeah, it's as I mentioned, it's something that Agriculture Victoria are working on at the moment. What it would mean, well, I guess maybe I should talk about the purpose of it first, because as I showed in those slides, that movement of infected livestock early in an outbreak very much determines how big the outbreak will ultimately become. And so to try and circumvent that, a livestock standstill, if there's certainly if there's a disease like foot and mouth disease confirmed, within 4 hours, there's the need to cease the movement of livestock around the countryside, and that's put in place to try and reduce the potential spread of an exotic disease. I'm not sure if I've explained that very well, but yeah, we have plans in place if we ever need to use it.
And this one's for Joe and Rob. So if we could go Rob first, how do you deal with fertilizer spreading companies and their vehicles?
That's a real problem. There's certainly no washdown before they come. Our fertiliser comes a very long way away, and I guess by the grace of God and the wing of a prayer, you hope that anything on their tyres, and I'm talking 35 k's, 40 k's away, anything on their tyres has gone on the road by the time they get into us. And certainly I've not witnessed any mud or anything like that on the vehicles as they've come in.
Yeah. And Joe, do you do anything different with yours?
With the spreading side, we spread our own. We've got our own machinery to spread our own. So it's carted in, and it's just tipped. Well, the trucks will come in, but they're mainly road trucks straight out of like the pivot in Geelong, and they'll come straight up the road. And they might tip in the paddock, or a lot of times we'll tip in the yard on a concrete pad, and we'll load it and spread it ourselves, which minimises the traffic out in the paddock.
That's great. So, Jeff, we've got another question here. With the major increase in deer and wild pigs, is there any chance of eradication of an invasive disease?
I think once again it's our chance of eradicating an exotic disease is to recognise it early and to minimise its spread, so that we've got the opportunity to do that. Certainly, and every outbreak is going to be different. I mean, during the 2001 foot and mouth disease outbreak, it was largely spread through sheep movements. They also had an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in 1967, which was largely spread by the movement of dairy trucks. Also, Taiwan had an outbreak which largely involved pigs. So every outbreak is going to be different. But yeah, certainly if something like foot and mouth disease virus got into our feral pig populations, it would be that much more of a challenge to eradicate it. The other thing is, it was interesting during the outbreak in the UK, in Cumbria. There were actually quite a few deer in the countryside there in Cumbria, through that affected countryside. And in that epidemiology group in which I worked, we even saw images of some clinically affected deer. And there was kind of a call early on as to, well, are these going to be important or not epidemiologically in an outbreak? As it turned out, they didn't do anything because they couldn't to stop the spread of foot and mouth disease through deer, but they were still able to eradicate it. So I guess the important thing there is that it's not necessarily going to kind of be the end game if it gets into feral livestock. But yeah, granted, it wouldn't help if it happened. Yeah.
So the next one is, what distance do you need on a boundary fence? So Jeff, I'm going to go to you because you'll be able to tell how far the particles will move through the air.
Yeah. So with foot and mouth disease, I mentioned that there was that piggery early on in the outbreak. And what happens in a piggery when you've got a large number of pigs that are producing virus? They produce what's known as a viral plume, which is almost like a cloud of virus which kind of raises above the property, and then depending on wind and things like that, it can actually spread a number of kilometres. So that's the extreme example. But more realistically, when you're talking about spread throughout the countryside, we were finding that most of the spread that was happening was kind of neighbour-to-neighbour spread, but there was also quite a bit of spread that was happening because of contaminated material, so contaminated machinery, contaminated footwear, which I guess is another way of saying problems to do with biosecurity. So when a property was found to have foot and mouth disease and it was distant from the other properties, it was generally because of that. That was the reason. Poor biosecurity was the reason that it got into a property. So it was a combination of neighbour-to-neighbour spread by aerosol and poor biosecurity. So yeah, for cattle and sheep, probably neighbour-to-neighbour. Yep.
So Jeff and Rob, how wide are your boundary fencing tree breaks? So Joe, do you want to go first?
Yeah, a lot of them would be, a lot of our tree breaks are all, they'd be 5 to 6 metres wide, plus they've got a hot wire on either side, and then we get to where the gateways are, we'll have a gate on either side, so that that gap is still, you go through a gateway and you've got to open it. It's a bit of a pain, but that's against what's on a cattle that we trade, so that, you know, it does actually keep a buffer. And I forgot to mention there before too that any cattle that do come in, when they come in their lots, they go to the one paddock and they stay in the one paddock. They never get, and we don't move them into other paddocks, so that, you know, we can trace them. We keep a good trace on them that way. But hot wires work really well, like electric fencing, just to keep them off. But anywhere we want to keep cattle well away from each other, there's a plantation or just a laneway. Laneways, we've got laneways too, that some of those could be anything up to 20, 25 metres wide for access for running stock in and out, and as well as vehicles and chaser bins and all that type of thing.
Yeah. And Rob?
Oh, for us, 80% of our boundary is double fenced with tree lanes, and internal fencing, a lot of it are tree laned, and what isn't is an outrigger hot wire on both sides of the fence, so no nose to nose.
Cool. And we've got one last question on the webinar platform. That when you buy new stock, how long should they be quarantined before moving on to pasture? I'm going to flick to Joe first. How long do you keep them in the same mobs, but how long do you put before they enter the system?
Normally, our program would be they're unloaded and straight into a fairly big holding pen, which is all wooden yards. It's all outside, but and they'll be there for the next day. As soon as they settle and they've quietened down a little bit, we'll bring them in. Everything is drenched. They're put back into that pen. We'll watch for lame cattle, all that sort of thing, if they've stood on in a truck. Or now that there's a lot of soft floors that you buy out of it, you're buying out of a market. We won't buy out of a market that doesn't have a soft floor because it's just too hard on their feet, and we get lameness. But normally, if they're there 5 to 6 days, tops, depends on how busy we are and how content the cattle are. The cattle are very content. there's indoor bred cattle, and we'll just walk them out, and really good. They're just really quiet. They're on good oat and hay, good water, and they're as happy as Larry. And it does, as Bob said there before, it just brightens them down. It teaches them a few manners. We're driving past them all the time, and you get an idea. You just watch for that one deer or heifer or whatever you think. Look at that one stand off again, or stand there swishing its tail, because obviously it's either lame or it's a little bit crook. It's been hurt, it's run into a gate. You know, the way people handle not a lot. Some people handle livestock, well, makes you wonder. But normally our game is about a week, and 5 days or a week, 7 days, but normally 5 days. They go out in a paddock, and that's where they stay until they come back in to be loaded.
Thank you. And Rob, how long do you take to induct cattle onto your property?
It can vary. Like Joe, we buy cattle that you wonder if they've got any manners at all, so that takes a little bit longer. But they're put into a yard with hay racks as soon as they arrive, and they're treated as soon as we possibly can, within a couple of days. They're a bit more compliant when they first come because they're tired and a bit sore. They don't argue with you quite as much, so it's easy to get around them. But then they're drifted into smaller paddocks that are close by the house and brought back again. So they're moved around and annoyed probably for about a week to get them quiet, depending on whether they've been weaned or not. If we're buying cattle that have not been weaned, and sometimes it takes a little bit longer. But we try and get them as quiet as we possibly can, but they are close handy to the yards in small paddocks, and they are on feed, on grass, but they can also have access to hay racks. Yep.
Right. Thank you, Rob. And Jeff, from a veterinary perspective, how long would be recommended before bringing to quarantine before bringing them into the system?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I would concur with Joe and Rob in what they've just been saying. You give them that drench, you give them the time to empty out so that they're no longer going to be excreting weed seeds, that type of thing. But I thought I'd also mention for any sheep producers who are listening in at the moment, the importance after bringing them in of making sure that before you put them with the rest of your flock, making sure that they don't have some sort of foot rot. So that would be the additional thing for the sheep producers. And sometimes you're looking at almost like a spread period where foot foot rot is going to show itself. But otherwise, I think Rob and Joe's advice is pretty sound there.
Awesome, that's great. Luke, we might just check and make sure there's no further questions on the phone platform, and then I'll conclude the webinar.
Just a reminder to those on the phone, if you'd like to ask a question this evening, you can do so by pressing *1 on the telephone keypad. We'll give you a moment to do so. We've got a question coming through from Margaret McDonald. Please go ahead, Margaret.
Yes, good evening. Just following on from that response from the sheep and the foot rot, unfortunately I missed the time frame that sheep should be quarantined or to be re-looked at. Thank you.
So with foot rot, it's important to check their feet upon introduction. But I guess if you're introducing sheep at a time when foot rot isn't going to express itself, and so we're talking about, say, summertime, sometimes it's worth just quarantining them for that little bit longer so that you can go through a period where it would express itself. And so when we get into that, or hopefully warmer, moist weather in autumn, or a spring period is a really good time for foot rot to express itself, just so that if it is kind of lurking there, for it to express itself before you put your sheep with the rest of your flock, because it's much easier to kind of contain it within a group of sheep that have just been introduced than to have to try and eradicate it or deal with it if it's got into the rest of your flock. So that's why I made that comment about sheep.
Does that answer your question, Mark?
Yes, thank you. I just wondered if he had any parameters in respect to the summer time frame versus the spring, autumn, spring.
I think the important thing is, recognising, when it's going to express itself, and it's possibly just going to almost sit there dormant during the summertime, but it will express itself once you get that autumn break. So.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff. Any other questions?
There don't appear to be any other questions coming through on the phone, Tess.
Thank you very much, Luke. So that concludes our biosecurity webinar. Thanks again to our presenters, Joe, Rob and Jeff. And thank you all for attending tonight. Shortly you'll be sent an email which will send you a link to a short survey. If you could please take the time to fill this out, as this allows us to offer you timely information. A transcript of this presentation will also be available on the registration portal link and will be provided in an email at a later stage. So thank you all very much for attending tonight, and I hope you have a good night. Thank you.